Maybe if you could take your seats then, and we'll proceed. I think we'll, if we can get people to, of course it was supposed to generate conversation, but if we can move to the next stage, one of the areas of need that we discovered was linking to First Nations across the country on issues having to do with business ethics. There are strengths in our network and there are areas of weakness, and in my view this is an area of weakness where we need to do work which has not yet been done. One of the people who has taken a particular interest in this range of issues in Canada over a very extended period of time now is Paul Wilkinson, who I met a number of years ago when Ontario Hydro was looking at upgrading facilities on some of Canada's great rivers off the Canadian Shield. The Matagami River was one of them into the Moose River Basin area. Paul has been working with First Nations for a long time, and ethics has been central to the work that he's been doing. He's one of the people who's drawn ethicists into his consulting work and build ethical principles into the kinds of negotiations that he's been so involved with. So I've invited Paul, who can only stay with us today, but I've invited Paul to say a little bit about what his hopes and expectations are with respect to the CBERN network.
Good, thank you. I think it's the first time I've ever been introduced as a spokesman for an area of weakness, but I consider it an honor. Je vais faire mon exposé en anglais, mais s'il y a des questions en français, cela me ferait plaisir d'y répondre en français. The title of my little talk fills me with terror in the sense that it contains three words: First Nations and perspective. Looking at me and listening to me, most of you will conclude very easily that I am not a member of a First Nation. We are fortunate to have two First Nation representatives in the room with us. The first whom you have already met is Chief Philip Inish of the Naskapi Nation of Kawawa-Chikumas, which is a Naskapi village located close to the former mining town of Schefferville in northern Quebec. I refer to Philip as my chief in the sense that I have worked with the Naskapi Nation for the past 32 years. The other First Nation representative is Deputy Chief Kim Rainville. I have to force myself not to pronounce it as if he were a Quebecer. Kim, whom I'm meeting for the first time today, but I've been a close friend and colleague of his chief, Chief Glenn Nolan, for many years, and Glenn has been very active with me in the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. All of this to say that the perspective that I can offer you is the perspective of an Irish immigrant to Canada who has lived and worked with many First Nations, about 75 First Nations and First Nation groups in many parts of Canada over the last 40 years. Wes touched on the reason why I am here, and that is that at the beginning of the 1990s, when the government of Ontario decided that the 25-year development plan of Ontario Hydro should be submitted to a generic environmental impact assessment, I was retained by a group of First Nations from the Moose River Basin in northern Ontario to advise, to act as their scientific advisor and coordinator. I had already been practicing as an environmental scientist for 10 or more years, and something that had always troubled me was that many of the issues brought to the table in environmental impact assessments, and in particular in the public hearings, really reflected not a concern about the actual impacts of a project on the ecosystem or society, but a fundamental ignorance on the part of the participants about the philosophy and the worldview of the other group. First Nations had a tendency to see developers, whether they were private sector or crown corporations, as being evil people who had no right to be doing what they were doing and were probably doing it, well, certainly for profit, but also with a view to destroying or disturbing Aboriginal society. On the part of many proponents, there was a comparable ignorance about the First Nations, and when they raised objections to development projects, they were very often seen as just being nuisance makers who had no particular right to this point of view. And this was always expressed in terms of impacts on caribou and impacts on fish and impacts on economies and so on. And it seemed to me at that time that unless a greater level of understanding between First Nations and developers who at that time were largely non-native could be achieved, that in the long run there was not a great deal of hope for reconciliation. And it occurred to me that the only people who could perhaps assist in achieving this level of mutual understanding were ethicists. And I didn't know any at the time. I don't quite remember how I got in touch with Wes. He was recommended, as was Jack Stevenson, who I think was at the University of Toronto at the time. And there was a third ethicist,
Michael McDonald, who's back.
Oh, Michael, yes, of course. Excuse me, I'd forgotten that, but I'm getting quite senile. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the mandate that we gave to them was to review the documentation tabled by Ontario Hydro with a view to taking from it the underlying beliefs and values of Ontario Hydro, and to do the same with the statements, written and other, of the First Nations, because we had organized a number of gatherings of elders and there were minutes of them. And the notion was that Wes and the team would try to help the First Nations understand why Ontario Hydro felt that it had the right and the obligation to do what it was doing, and to try and help Ontario understand why the First Nations were not entirely happy with it, because it was the case that they weren't. And I think we all got off to a wonderful start, and Wes and his colleagues produced some papers which I certainly read with very great interest. Sadly, Ontario Hydro came to the conclusion quite early on that the outcome of this generic environmental impact assessment was probably not going to be something that it wanted. And so it withdrew from the assessment before we had time to go to the table and to pursue the work that we had commissioned Wes and the others to do. But I think I'm right in thinking that that was what was behind the values mapping exercise that has been referred to, and that to some extent it stimulated Wes's ongoing involvement in Aboriginal issues, mining issues, and so on. I think there's reason to be optimistic that with application, and I know that that application will be given, that First Nations will become important participants in the network. And I say this because what I like about the network, as is true of this weekend's gathering, is that it is a dialogue or a conversation. And of course, Aboriginal First Nation societies conduct their business not in writing and not with